It is my honor to introduce this event. For those who don't know it, the Dean's Forum is a tradition in which when a faculty member publishes a book, someone else from the faculty, ideally someone in a different field entirely, relates to the book to open up a conversation across disciplines, something that we try to and do well here, better than anywhere else here at Swift Hall at the University of Chicago. Today the focus is on Karin Krause's new book, Divine Inspiration in Byzantium. Karin Krause, as you all know very well, is Associate Professor of Byzantine Art and Religious Culture. Karin is the author of two books. The first book is on the images of the illuminations of John Chrysostom in Byzantine, in Byzantium, a wonderful book, also with many pictures, written in German. And this one produced in English, really a fantastic read. Karin's work today will be responded to by Professor Richard Miller. Rich Miller is the Laura Spelman Rockefeller Professor of Religion, Ethics, and Politics. How we proceed is as follows. When I give up the mic, Karin will present just in short order an introduction to her work. Rich will respond, presenting sharp insights and critiques with respect to this very dense and very illuminating book. Karin will be able to respond to Rich, and then you will have an opportunity to ask questions and respond. So Karin, Rich's response, Karin's response to Rich's response, your response to Karin's response to Rich's response to this wonderful book. Welcome, Karin and Rich, to today's Dean's Forum.
Thank you very much, Jim, for this introduction and for hosting this conversation. Thanks also to the staff members involved in planning this event, especially Sarah Bigger and Bill Gerasi. And thank you all for being here and welcome. The topic that I discuss in this book has intrigued me for quite some time. Long ago, when I was investigating the illustrated homilies of John Chrysostom for my doctoral dissertation, I was struck by the frequency and variety of claims made about the divine inspiration of this church father in Byzantine literature and visual arts. This led me to explore broadly the ideas current in Byzantium about the divine origin of the empire's sacred writings. Arguments about divinely inspired literature were in fact ubiquitous, and they reveal notions of authenticity that were pivotal for the construction and defense of Byzantine Orthodox identity. Related ideas feature prominently in religious polemics in which they serve to assert divinely bestowed authority and religious superiority over pagans and Jews, as well as over Christians whose teachings were deemed heretical. Early Christianity derived the concept of the divine revelation of its holy scriptures through two different strands, Greco-Roman polytheism and ancient Judaism. All of these cultures share the notion of the divine breath bestowed upon humans, most often to enable them to pronounce a divine, hence unquestionably authoritative message. However, inspiration in the literal sense is just one procedure among several through which mortals receive divine gifts. For instance, accounts relating the dispensation of divinely crafted objects to humans make a particularly strong case for authenticity and authority. The stone tablets of the law conveyed to Moses are a prominent example that was extremely influential in the Byzantine realm. In this book, I use inspiration as an umbrella term, or rather an umbrella metaphor, to investigate different narratives about the divine origin of capabilities, texts, and material objects present in the human sphere. I was especially interested in examining the reinterpretations that the traditional ideas underwent in Byzantium, transformations that are evidenced in written and visual sources. From the early Christian period on, images play a particularly important role as a means of propaganda. Ironically, iconography is oftentimes far more explicit than texts and thus compelling evidence of the fundamental change in attitude towards the authority of sacred writings in the Christian realm. Several early images of inspired evangelists depart rather strongly from pagan iconography in that they emphasize the accurate documentation of the divinely conveyed text in writing, often upon dictation. I have found that textual narratives and certain iconographical motifs mirror contemporaneous developments in the legal realm. Texts and images thus characterize the sacred writ as legally binding. For many centuries, Christianity was reluctant to make similar claims of divine inspiration with regard to its art, and I wonder if this fact explains why the development of a specifically Christian iconography was much delayed. In Byzantium, the widely acknowledged lack of a divine contribution to man-made art was one of the major causes of the image controversy of the 8th and 9th centuries that we commonly call iconoclasm. It is therefore revolutionary that theologians did eventually advance the claim that it is not human artistry, but divine inspiration that ultimately ensures an icon's authenticity, its resemblance to its prototype. Neglected sources help illuminate the broader implications of this view as they reveal persisting concerns regarding the venerability of icons. Arguments about inspired icons and artisans were advanced by some of the empire's most esteemed intellectuals, and they were clearly designed to elevate the status of material art to that of Holy Scripture. Just as with Byzantium's most sacred texts, divine inspiration guarantees accuracy and thus conformity, in this case of visual representations. Importantly, the boldest claims about divinely inspired art were only made long after iconoclasm was officially terminated and condemned as a heresy in 843. The sources clearly show that the major theological issues that had precipitated the icon crisis remained unresolved, and that concerns about the venerability of icons persisted. It turns out that the same concerns regarding the validity of Christian icons are also evident in post-iconoclastic sources about the Mandylion. After its arrival in Constantinople in the 10th century, the Mandylion became an object of unparalleled importance for the religious and political identity of the Byzantines. It and related objects were venerated as so-called archeropoietos icons of Christ, that is, icons believed to have miraculously emerged without human artistry on linen towels and clay tiles. Exploring a range of sources, I have taken a fresh look at the nature and significance of these objects. Contrary to modern scholarly assumptions, they were in official writings from Byzantium not seen as material icons displaying Christ's portrait. They were rather understood as signifiers of Christ, as the true image of God the Father in a purely ontological sense. It turns out that Byzantine sources on the Mandylion are strongly informed by Christological arguments first voiced in the New Testament and patristic literature. Textual analysis shows that the object and its legend were used by religious and political leaders to affirm and defend the full divinity of Christ. And this same argument is used to make a case for why these objects, and indeed material icons in general, cannot possibly depict Christ's human features. Hence, here as well, intellectuals seriously questioned the legitimacy of visual representations of Christ. Post-iconoclastic writings on divinely inspired and divinely crafted icons suggest strongly that we need to re-evaluate the history of Byzantine iconoclasm. At least from the perspective of theology, the image crisis did by no means end when it was officially put to rest in the 9th century, nor had it been resolved when the Empire of Byzantium came to an end in 1453. Yet the Orthodox Church continues to commemorate the official termination of Byzantine iconoclasm with a major festival. And it tells us a lot that this feast is called the Sunday of Orthodoxy, or the Triumph of Orthodoxy. It speaks for the power of icons that, against all odds, they remain an indispensable part of Orthodox religious practice. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Karin, for your comments. I want to begin as well by thanking Dean Robinson for sponsoring these fora, and to the various folks, Sarah, Bill, perhaps Arima, others, Suzanne, Taryn, for helping to organize it. These fora enable us to move out of our areas to engage each other's works across disciplines and other specializations. If scholars of religion are to speak to a wider public, this forum is an excellent way to model how that might be done. I hope that my comments fit that bill, and I look forward to our conversation today. Now, before I dive into specifics, let me say that Professor Krause has produced a remarkable book of scholarship by any measure. Indeed, divine inspiration in Byzantium itself seems inspired, given its superhuman tenacity, rigor, and attention to visual and theological detail. I want to congratulate her on this achievement and thank her for shedding light on such a diverse range of interesting and important material. Covering the period from 1330 to 1483, divine inspiration in Byzantium moves into and then beyond the period of iconoclasm in the East, reminding us that the production and veneration of icons was no simple or uncomplicated matter in early and medieval Christianity. Indeed, their production implicated wider disputes about the relation of image to prototype, appearance, and reality. It also implicated concerns about how divinity was to be depicted and whether any such depiction was theologically acceptable, if I understand the argument correctly. The book's subtitle, Notions of Authenticity in Art and Theology, may be a bit deceptive to readers who are hoping to expect to study the visual arts for which Byzantium is well known, namely the icon. To be sure, the icon is an object of inquiry in this book, and masterfully so. But iconic materials exist alongside texts, textual commentary, ceramic materials, mosaics, manuscript illumination, textiles, and various combinations in Professor Krause's study. The book offers over 70 images from galleries, monasteries, churches, and university holdings, from Moscow to Washington, D.C., to Milan, to Paris, to London, to the Vatican, and more. The sweep of visual materials is stunning. I learned a lot from reading this book, and I recommend it to everyone interested in the history of Christianity, especially but not only Eastern Christianity, as well as the visual arts and crafts of this period. Professor Krause's book is also about the work that visual representations of divine inspiration performed in establishing exceptionalist claims on behalf of Christianity. She pays close attention to her core topic, divine inspiration in religious literature and the visual arts in Byzantium, with a clear eye to the theological work that these materials performed in light of Trinitarian and Christological debates, such as those held in Nicaea and Chalcedon. Of special importance is how Byzantine materials claimed or depicted divine revelation to underwrite their authenticity. By authenticity, Professor Krause notes, ancient Greek and Byzantine writers meant a cluster of overlapping ideas, designating, for example, the possession of absolute sovereign power, possessing originality, being a reliable testimony, and being warranted, genuine, and authoritative. The wealth of these metaphors, which are typically associating authenticity with certain kinds of literature, she writes, is, quote, reflected and indeed much enriched in the visual arts. Professor Krause makes plain that the materials on which she focuses drew on concepts of extra-human inspiration to establish their authenticity. But again, those efforts did not occur in a cultural vacuum. Instead, they were embroiled in various forms of religious polemics and apologetics. They aimed to establish the superiority of Christian teachings and apostolic leadership against Jewish, Roman, and Greek alternatives. What early iconography shows, in part, is how Christian authors and their writings were inspired, often dictated, by God in one form or another. I want to show a couple of images in a minute before I turn to my questions. The clear point is to provide visual reasons to authorize Christian supersessionism. In this respect, her sources are both polemical and apologetical regarding Christianity and its rivals. But it's also the case that her materials carry out intra-polemical work. Claims to Christian orthodoxy regarding the Trinity and Christology were at stake, as were claims to political and cultural identity in Byzantium. This last point was especially provocative to me, and I'll return to it shortly. Let me say a little bit more about this work before turning to my questions and offering some interesting images. At one level, the book traces ways in which the idea of divine inspiration influenced how Christian artists depicted venerated Christian authors and holy people. Professor Krause provides an instructive story that moves the reader through Greek and Roman ideas about inspiring muses, to Jewish notions surrounding divine pneuma, to Christian ways of appropriating these ideas to establish the authority and superiority of its ideas and holy figures. But it is also about debates surrounding the veneration of images and the terms according to which an image was understood to represent its prototype and on what terms it did so. The book describes how venerating icons and relics was contested, as well as how certain objects of veneration were actually thought to be alive with the presence of God and the presence of Christ. And perhaps she can say a bit more about that in her remarks. Of particular interest for Professor Krause is the Mandylion, a textile that legendarily was used by Jesus to wipe off his sweat. In the process, the cloth received an imprint of the image of his face. Professor Krause devotes 2 chapters to analyzing this textile, its movement from Edessa to Constantinople, and finally to Paris, where it was destroyed during the Revolution, tracking how accounts of Christ's image in the textile rehearsed ongoing debates about Christ's heavenly and earthly nature. That the textile was hidden from public view only seems to have exacerbated its mystery and these disputes. To develop her ideas, Professor Krause explores not only canonical sources with which many of us may be familiar, the New Testament Gospels, the letters of Paul, for example, but also a wealth, and I mean a wealth, of non-canonical materials that circulated during this period. The knowledge and intellectual acuity needed to bring these materials into focus is phenomenal. I commend her for this accomplishment and consider this work to be exemplary, the kind that we justifiably celebrate in Swift Hall. Now, I've only scratched the surface of this extensive study, but let me offer a few images to help focus our remarks, and then I'll pose a question or two or three. So this is the golden mouth, right? Chrysostom, being offered a scroll to eat. It's kind of interesting. Ingesting, right? And that being itself a kind of inspiration, right? A mediation. I'm just putting these up because I found them, okay? But here we have this material item that's being identified as a source of inspiration, right? This is Chrysostom being inspired by the Apostle Paul, right? So there's a mediation through a holy figure in Christianity, right? And then here's another one, all right? Being divinely inspired, obviously, from the heavens. So I just found it interesting that these forms of inspiration, the media themselves, vary, right? These are a couple of examples of that variation, right? And I just found that intriguing, you know, that inspiration is mediated through a number of different kinds of vessels, you might say, directly and indirectly. So, you know, maybe saying, but those aren't my questions. Let me turn to my questions. This is just all by way of, I hope, priming the pump. So question number one has to do with theology. And after reading this work, I wondered what implied, I'll call it doctrine, but I mean that in a very open sense. Doctrine of God is presupposed in accounts of divine inspiration. It seems to me that there's a lot of what's called pneumatology involved here, the Holy Spirit's action, and a sense of ongoing revelation, right? And so I just wonder if you could say a little bit more about what or whether there's some common or overlapping understandings of divinity in relation to Christianity and these figures that you might be able to elaborate upon. Second question is that occasionally in this work, Professor Krause rather gently identifies lacunae, absences, silences, mistakes in scholarship surrounding the topic under review. And I invite her just to say a little bit more about what her foils might be or were, how she would position this contribution in dialogue with the wider body of scholarship surrounding the visual arts and theology in Byzantium. Exactly who are her fellow travelers, whose work is being corrected for here, right? So educate us about, you might say, your wider conversation partners. And then the third question has to do with iconoclasm. And iconoclasm is something of an important character or player in this story. And at the conclusion of the book, Professor Krause, at the end of a lengthy discussion about the importance of the visual arts and accompanying theology for establishing the cultural identity of Byzantium, right? I would invite her to say a little bit more about what you mean there and what exactly was at stake. And there's her concluding sentence is a question. And like all questions that students ask, some of you know this, I have a sense you might have an answer or an intimation of it. And so I'd like to hear. So here's the question. I'll read the last paragraph. Okay. The fact that to this day, and this picks up some of her remarks. The veneration of icons is an indispensable element of religious life in the Eastern Orthodox world, is evidence of their enduring power beyond all doubts and apprehensions. However, this book has revealed that Byzantine iconoclasm and its aftermath are in need of further examination and reevaluation on theological grounds. In light of the fact that profound concerns about religious icons, especially those of Christ, persisted long after 843, the end of iconoclasm, it must be asked, was iconoclasm ever truly defeated in Byzantium? Now, that's for the reader to consider, and I invite some comments from Professor Krause as well on that score. So with that, thank you again. Thanks to Dean Robinson. I look forward to Professor Krause's comments and to the conversation that ensues. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Richard. That was both very generous and a very well informed response. Thanks for the care. You gave me a lot to think with. Thanks also for addressing some of the images, which I'm sure is not what you usually do. You're right. There are very different forms of how divine inspiration or a divine gift to humans manifests itself in Byzantium, and that goes a long way back to ancient cultures of the Mediterranean. So this is actually a nice example, because what you see here is John Chrysostom writing text, his commentary to the letter of Paul's letter to the Romans onto a scroll, and behind him stands the Apostle Paul. So this is a relatively late image, illustrations to an account that first comes up in late antiquity and relates how John Chrysostom is, as he is trying to write a commentary on Paul's letters, he's uninspired and he has a writing block, and thoughts won't come to him, and then he falls in a kind of trance, and without him knowing, Paul visits him and whispers the comments into his ear. So that makes a strong claim of continuity when the biblical author himself also provides interpretation of his biblical writing. So the idea of continuity is very strongly expressed here, in this case between the biblical writings and patristic literature. And that is, of course, important to authorize what the exegetes wrote during late antiquity about those books. And this story and pictorial formula then becomes disseminated, and it becomes kind of an author portrait, so to speak, that adorns many manuscripts in Byzantium that contain different texts of Chrysostom. So the image is quickly disassociated from its original context, the commentary of the letters of Paul. So it migrates into all kinds of contexts and it becomes embellished. So the original story makes that claim. So Paul is actually the author of Chrysostom's homilies, the true author. But as you see here, Christ is also involved. And of course, the background for all of this is that Paul himself was divinely inspired. There was no doubt about that in Byzantium, in Christianity. So in reality, all of this comes not from Chrysostom or Paul, but from Christ. The element of writing is a novel feature that we first find in texts and then images of late antiquity, of early Christianity, to make claims to the unaltered documentation of divine inspiration as it was transmitted. So we find motifs of dictations that are very popular, and legible text. You cannot read it here because it's too small, but most often the texts that are being recorded in these miniatures can be identified beyond doubt. So this is a huge shift in comparison to ancient cultures. This was not found in polytheistic Greco-Roman context. We do have some foreshadowing of this, the accuracy of the divine message being recorded. We do find a predecessor of this in Jewish culture, so that is also not surprising that Christians actually used that as a source for their inspiration. So this image, for example, makes multiple claims. Then also regarding the dissemination, so the continuity doesn't stop with the exegete, but later generations, bishops in this case, later exegetes, are able to draw on these sources for their own arguments. This is another nice example from later times showing the inspiration of Gregory of Nazianzus, in this case by the dove of the Holy Spirit that comes from a heavenly segment. And he too writes upon dictation of the divine spirit, and interestingly, his scroll is shared with a later commentator, Elias of Crete, who was active centuries later. So the idea is again that the original source, in this case homilies by a church father, are interpreted in the same spirit in which they were originally written. So again, this claim of continuity, which is important in Byzantium because Byzantium was conservative. It wasn't so easy to introduce new texts and novel ideas. So you wanted to make claims to the authority of later writings of the Middle Ages as being in the same spirit and possessing the same authority as the biblical writings and patristic literature. So there are more examples. You mentioned the ingestion of scrolls. That, of course, goes back to biblical models. First of all, the ingestion by Ezekiel of a scroll. So that is a very strong message of unchanged texts being swallowed in their original form and then expressed orally exactly as they were put down in writing earlier on. So revelation is indeed ongoing, as you said, and images and text make this plain. So you asked about the lack of scholarship. There is a lot of scholarship on inspiration in ancient cultures, both with regard to the inspiration of literature, but also iconography in the Roman world. We have tons of depictions of the muses. And when I first started to look into this more, I was actually surprised that for Byzantium, we find relatively few studies that describe such phenomena and interpret them and unravel their meaning. So that was, of course, very good when you start out, and then you can basically work from scratch in various respects. Of course, the original ideas of inspiration that we already find in early Christian literature, and there's a lot of scholarship there, they survive to some extent in Byzantium unchanged. So that is not so novel, but the inspiration of art, that was one of the greatest surprises during my work, to see to what extent claims were made in the Middle Ages about inspired icons, inspired art. And it is there that we find this interesting emergence of this idea of the spirit, which can both provide skills or intellectual input, ideas, texts, and so forth, but is also, in the first place, an enlivening breath And when it comes to icons, they come alive, at least in rhetoric. So they are so full of the Holy Spirit that they appear as if they were the prototypes themselves. And I was curious why scholars and really leading intellectuals of Byzantium insisted on this so much. And so that chapter where I discuss this question, that also sheds light on how the Byzantines in general perceived their icons, how they used them, what concerns they had when they used them. Very solid anxieties. Is this icon really a true object? Does it resemble its prototype, a saint or Christ living? So that is the essential prerequisite for the veneration of icons that make an icon holy. And inspiration is the key argument, actually, that is brought up to as an answer to these persisting concerns about icons. I mean, we do have icons, fortunately, and they manage to survive. Yet it does surprise me because with the Creed of Chalcedon at the very latest in the mid-5th century, visual representations of Christ in particular became a real problem, because if Christ is both human and divine, inseparably united in one nature, how do you represent the divine in an image? Even the most image-friendly theologians of Byzantium would have seen that as a problem. Nobody said that you can actually circumscribe in a human image the divinity. And the Archeropoietos icons, so those icons believed not to have been made by human craft, they are an even stronger response to that question. And that was the second big surprise. When I started out working on those, I also thought that these were believed to have been imprints, miraculous imprints that showed the portrait of Christ, and thus an especially authentic portrait and so forth. And when I looked into the sources, many questions emerged. And it is really clear that when these miraculous imprints first came up in the Mediterranean in the 6th century, they emerged as a very vital part of the image question, of the dispute about the validity of Christian icons, of their right to exist, and the whole the narratives about these images, which are interesting to read, very entertaining legends. Those legends and also more theological approaches to these images reveal quite clearly that there was a lot of unease about depictions of Christ in art, not only divinely made ones, but also and especially ones that were made by humans. So that is another context where you see those profound doubts to surface. And when iconoclasm was finally terminated by imperial force in the mid-9th century, no reasons were supplied of why all of a sudden it was okay to venerate, to create and venerate images of Christ in particular. It was just decreed. And when you don't address a problem, as we all know, it tends to keep coming back all the time. And this is what we see in Byzantium. Although you couldn't easily phrase those doubts clearly, because in 843 iconoclasm was condemned as a heresy. So to say explicitly, but wait a minute, why is it, there are problems with that, how do you depict the divinity of Christ? You couldn't say that so easily, because you would have been regarded a heretic in Byzantium, and that was not good, could be very dangerous indeed. And so I've talked a lot about the concerns against icons, but all the time we see that people really need these images. And in the photos that were on my last slide, you see this. So on the Sunday of Orthodoxy, people carry icons in procession, they display them, they venerate them in public. So Christians do need these images, obviously, as a means to communicate with the divine realm, at least in Catholicism and in Orthodoxy, we see all kinds of manifestations of image veneration to this day. So the whole context of iconoclasm, that was a side product actually of my research, but I found that actually most interesting because the existence and veneration of icons is an important part of that identity, and you see that in a major feast. The Feast of Orthodoxy as such is one in which the veneration of images is celebrated and commemorated. So it is an important cultural asset. And orthodoxy, claims to religious orthodoxy are the key element of cultural identity in the empire. When you have images of emperors, they always have labels that give their names, and those labels would always also confirm in writing that the emperor was pious and orthodox. So what was deemed orthodox and unorthodox, that was of course under a lot of discussion, and the image controversy actually illustrates quite nicely the problems that were at stake, namely Christological problems around the Trinity, but especially around the dual nature of Christ. Sometimes when you read treatises about icons, their defense or their rejection, you wonder at some point, is this really about icons, or is it actually about theological questions that you have named in your response? So it's quite interesting to see how directly images and their veneration is tied to theology and the wider theological discourse and what constitutes orthodoxy in the Byzantine Empire. And I'm over time.
No, you're perfect.
Thank you again. Thanks to Richard.
Thank you so much. It was very, very interesting, very exciting. I can't wait to actually read the book. So I have one question, essentially the same question. We do find, as you mentioned, this divine inspiration idea also in the Hellenic literature, like the muse, Homer, appeals to the muse for inspiration. And indeed, so I guess the purpose that serves is to give a form of authenticity, even credibility to that account, that this is really something. It's not like I made up the Iliad or the Odyssey, but these are real events. So there is a kind of factual and truth-based function that divine, appealing to the divine has. So I was wondering if that is the same in the Byzantine appeal to the divine, in the sense that it does lend authenticity. This is the real thing, and it's the real word of. So that's one. And then the second, it's about iconoclasm, and I think it's related. So I guess what motivated iconoclasm was a kind of fear that the icon will be venerated, if devoid of divine inspiration, will be venerated as an idol, like idolatry, so something that is just a thing and you venerate the thing and not really the kind of inspired. So I was wondering if you think these two are related, like the idol part was like a Greek influence, like, the Greeks worship the idols and we don't want to have that, and whether you think the two are connected. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Anastasia. These are great questions. So I looked a lot into the predecessors of these ideas in the ancient Mediterranean, and Hesiod's Theogony is actually the only text that makes a very explicit remark about the procedure of inspiration, the divine breath being conveyed to the poet so that he can speak of the things that were that he received from the muses. We do not have explicit remarks or descriptions of procedures anywhere else, and so, and the question is even there, like, to what extent did Hesiod then convey what the muses told him, because the same text implies, it might not be true. So there is a lot of vagueness in these ancient accounts, and you see that also in the iconography of humans inspired by muses. You cannot really tell what's happening, like how is truth constituted. You see a muse next to a poet or philosopher, and the philosopher is seen reading or talking with the muse. So we do not learn from these images anything about veracity of accounts, of information conveyed. And what's interesting, is that although Christianity took up many of those ideas and metaphors in text and images, that there is, since late antiquity, there were made attempts to depict or say concretely how a text was conveyed. So the element of dictation is very strong, and that is largely absent in the ancient realm.
So there is a difference between inspiration and dictation.
Yes.
So inspiration is, that's exactly very, very good. So inspiration is, you're inspired, but you don't have a dictator, someone that tells you exactly what to write. So there is this room for, innovation or creation. So inspiration is a kind of creation as well. So the veracity, the veridicality of what he said is not like 100% guaranteed. But that's also because it's not like religious context, right? Or religious text. But in the religious text, do we have the sense of your reading that it's dictation and not inspiration? In those things where like you have those images that you showed, that it's dictation, or could we say that the same holds for like the Quran, for example, where like it's the word of God being told onto Muhammad and he writes, like, are there differences? But I think that difference between inspiration and dictation is good, and it's accurate, like in distinguishing two different kinds of inspiration.
So dictation actually encompasses inspiration. It's the inspired text that is being dictated and then recorded in writing with great accuracy. So it's not just a summary of the divine inspiration, but the exact message, and that matters a lot, of course, in the Christian argument. Your second question about idols. Christians were very wary of potentially adoring idols, and that's another reason of why very late, we only have imagery very late. Inspiration of icons, those arguments were made exactly because of this, to make sure that the icon that is being venerated is holy. And it is holy because it closely resembles the prototype, the living person represented on it. Formal resemblance was key in Byzantium, because if an icon lacked likeness to its prototype, it was not an icon, but an idol. So in order to have a true and venerable prototype, you needed to have the element of likeness, and inspiration is one of the means to assure that the icon looks like its prototype. And again, in icons, we find that dual sense of the pneuma, the breath, which also in that case enlivens the icon, and in rhetoric in Byzantium, we find views that icons actually become alive, which is a very logical conclusion, actually, from thinking about the procedure. So the boundaries between like Christian Orthodox veneration of icons and the veneration of idols, they are really fluent. Like, what do you venerate? Do you adore the icon, which was totally not what was expected or from Christians, or do you venerate the person, the prototype behind the icon, through the icon as a vehicle?
Karin, I have a follow-up question. In both cases, it seems as if the efficacy of the material is detached from any human production. Right, that as I read the book, we start looking at more and more material that is understood to be either untainted or less tainted by a human creator, right? Or certainly what work it does is entirely detached. There's a real effort to build a firewall. And so I guess, could you just say more about that? Because it seems there that some either Christological issues are at play about the relationship between, let's say, the human and the divine. I just found it interesting that those moves were being made, and I wonder if you could say a bit more about that.
Yeah, thank you. There is indeed this concerns about material and human artistic creation, which is something that is even late in Byzantium seen as a potential problem. And those divinely imprinted icons try to respond to that. But the texts that we have, that the legends behind these objects, they draw a clear line between divine creation and human creation. And I read the text about those objects allegorically. So it's actually divine creation that is in the center of all of this argument, and it ultimately serves again to advance a theological argument. So the materials have long puzzled me, like textile towels, linen towels, and clay tiles. So cheap materials, common materials. Why do they feature so prominently in these accounts? And so with time, I realized both linen and clay are strong allusions to human flesh. We find these comparisons and metaphors already in pre-Christian context. So that is also not a coincidence. Right. And these objects actually, aside from making comments about divine and human creativity, what they do is make a theological statement with regard to the incarnation of Christ. This is what they are all about. So in a sense, these objects that replicate, so one object imprints the next, we have numerous texts about that, those replications are actually allegorical repetitions, endlessly repeated of the incarnation of Christ. So all of these objects and the legends that are really entertaining and nice to read, they have a very strong theological undercurrent, make very deeply thought through theological arguments.
Thank you.
I think Margie was next.
Thanks to both of you. What a marvelous panel. I wanted to come in on the question of dictation and inspiration and say that a crucial figure that actually makes the line between inspiration and dictation difficult is the prophet. Because the prophet, like the prophets of Israel, speak in the Spirit of God, but then they go on to say, Ko Amar Adonai, thus says the Lord. So there's a way in which they're actually vessels of an exact transmission of the message, but in other cases, they don't use that formula. And that's true of the Puthian prophetess at Delphi, that she's inspired and she speaks, but she needs an interpreter in order to make clear what she says. So these are mechanics of mediation that make that distinction, I would say, a little bit hard. Professor Krause, I have a hard question. And my hard question relates to Professor Miller's last question. And that is to say, do we ever in the history of Christianity have resolution to any of the heresiological debates? In other words, does the Christological formula of Chalcedon of two natures, indissolubly and indivisibly mixed, does it not, in fact, in the history of Christian thought, people are always saying you're too far on one end, you're too far on another. And isn't in many ways one of the crucial issues, and you just named it so beautifully, is that the incarnation is an improbable mix of the divine and material reality. And so always in the history of Christian thought is this debate that you go too far on one end and you're a Marcionite. you're claiming that material reality cannot contain the Godhead and therefore it was created by a bad, evil God, or you go the other way and you've completely divinized the world and you've made no distinction between the divine and the human. So in other words, back to your final sentence, what would resolution even look like if iconoclasm were completely defeated?
So in Byzantium, we actually see throughout its existence that the empire continued to be shaken by those heresies, Trinitarian heresies and heresies questioning the full divinity of Christ. And these theological concerns, they are directly tied with images. And I don't have a solution for this because these are constructions. They are not always logical when they were first developed. Like how exactly do we have to imagine Christ's nature as dual, and people continue to grapple with that. I mean, we have doctrines on one and creeds on one side, and lots of questions on the other side. So yeah, I agree with you that it is probably an unsurpassable problem.
So one more question.
I would like to ask if in the literature that you've been through to create this like very difficult and multiply interesting contribution, are there any links with iconoclasm and the practices of Islam that has been, because from what we know, it's not allowed to depict pretty much anybody. Do you think they may have taken, or is there a link? I mean, that they may have taken the different direction than the one that was more popular in the West. Sorry.
Yes. Yeah. Thanks for that question. It has sometimes been surmised that the rise of Islam has actually contributed or prompted the Byzantines to think more critically about their image veneration. There is little to no proof for this. I find very interesting that in all the sources I've been studying, there's a lot of reception of Judaism, rejection and appropriation, very creative forms of appropriation, but Islam is largely absent, and that has to do with historical reasons and with the fact that Islam was in Byzantium rejected as a heresy, and it was also a relatively late religion, so that wasn't such a threat. Judaism and the claims of Judaism, the Byzantines grappled with and needed to come up with arguments of why they themselves supersede those the ancient covenant of God between the Israelites. But Islam is strangely absent from the discussion in the sources.
Yes, so because Muhammad lives in the 7th century and it is in the 9th century that the iconoclasm, but I mean, there may have been an overlap.
Yeah.
And of course, all these things are not falsifiable. This is why we never had any resolution.
Yeah.
This is why maybe enlightenment was one direction to take, but still it's creations of humanity and they are admirable.
It's possible that there were connections, but they are difficult to prove. Okay.
So thank you, and join me in thanking Karin.